Hello, Sarah here. Before we get into today's episode, I am thrilled to share that our next AJFF in Conversation webinar, the final webinar of 2020, will be taking place Monday, November 9th at 7 p.m. Eastern. Our very special guest for that webinar will be Israeli Academy Award-winning director Yuval Adler, whose new film, The Secrets We Keep, is a star-studded post-World War II thriller. Film critic and previous podcast guest Jason Evans will be moderating. To watch the film on VOD and register for our webinar, please go to ajff.org/inconversation. You won't want to miss it. Thank you, and without further ado, please now enjoy this episode. Hi, I'm Sara Glassberg, and this is AJFF in Conversation, the Jewish film podcast. Halloween is mere days away now, so what better time to dive into Jewish horror cinema and explore what really constitutes a Jewish horror movie anyway. To briefly offer some personal context, I love horror movies and grew up believing the genre is more than just gore. I always subscribe to the idea that horror movies serve as a powerful vehicle for allegory, and Jewish horror movies are likely no exception. There is the recent trend in the last 10 years or so of horror cinema out of Israel, for instance. While it may be that this is a form of escapism in contrast to the country's cinematic tradition of satirical comedies and art house dramas, there may also be some social or cultural preoccupations being explored. Take JeruZalem from 2015, written and directed by Doron and Yoav Paz. This film, shot in found footage style or shaky cam through the POV of a character's Google Glass device, follows two American Jewish tourists who find themselves in Jerusalem on Yom Kippur while the city falls under attack by winged demons that create more of themselves in a similar fashion to zombies through biting and scratching. This may be an overly simplistic interpretation, but shots of foreboding military presence and overall chaos might lead one to read the film as responding to real-life tensions in the region. Israeli horror may certainly be part of Jewish horror, but there is still so much more, especially when it comes to uniquely Jewish myths, monsters, and stories that simply lend themselves well to the horror genre. For example, while the flying demon zombies in JeruZalem are unique, there are also a number of real traditions mentioned in that film, including the Jewish Golem story. That brings us to another Paz Brothers film that we will talk about today, 2018's The Golem, which we showed at AJFF like we did with JeruZalem. It takes place in a small shtetl in Lithuania in the 1600s and centers on Hannah, a woman who creates a golem to protect her shtetl from nearby peasants who threaten violence and blame the Jewish people for a plague outbreak. Then there is 2015's Demon, a dybbuk tale from Poland, taking place in the present day, but certainly grappling with the past and collective historical trauma. To help us understand and unpack golems, dybbuks, and more, and help answer that ultimate question of what is Jewish horror, I am joined by two very special guests. B. Sonenreich is editor-in-chief of Oz Magazine, the Atlanta-based magazine focusing on the film and television, print, and new media industries. B is also a good friend of mine who has published and presented on the topic of horror film and the Holocaust. Ed Simon is the author of several books, including the upcoming The God Beat, What Journalism Says About Faith and Why It Matters, as well as the recent Printed in Utopia, The Renaissance's Radicalism. An editor-at-large for the Marginalia Review of Books, a contributing editor for the History News Network, and a staff writer at The Millions, he has written on Judaism and horror for publications like Tablet Magazine. B. Ed, thank you so much for being with us today. I would like to begin with something that I think will be pretty foundational to most of what we're going to want to talk about today. And that is something so specific to Jewish horror. And that is, what are dybbuks and golems? I mentioned them briefly in the introduction, but I wanted to really wait to talk to both of you to kind of go into detail and explain what those terms are, what the histories are there, and of course we'll get to how they come up in some of the horror movies we're going to be talking about today. So Ed, I'll start with you with that if you want to kick us off with what are dybbuks and golems.
Sure. So I think between the two of them, the golem is probably the one that is more widely known. And it's kind of like iconically an example of Jewish horror. When somebody says Jewish horror, I think the golem is who would come into mind for a lot of people. And that's because the golem, before I explain what he is exactly, is something that exists not just in Jewish literature and Jewish folklore, but has kind of been appropriated by the wider culture as well. So, there were German expressivist films from the 1920s that were about the golem that were made by Gentiles, where the golem, appears in like an episode of the X-Files, for example, right? So the golem is kind of the prototypical example of something scary from Jewish folklore, I guess. What the golem is supposed to be is basically an artificial man who is constructed normally out of clay or out of mud or dirt, and through kind of magical incantation, through Kabbalistic formula, he is endowed with life. So he's kind of a lesser creation made by man in the way he sort of relates to man in the way that man relates to God, I guess is sort of the way to think about it. And in most legends, the golem is ascribed to having been constructed by Rabbi Judah ben Lo, who was a real figure in Renaissance Prague. He lived in 16th century Prague, which was a city that had sort of a reputation for kind of non-denominational magic, I guess I would put it. You had sort of people who were interested in magic across various religious traditions. You had Jews, Catholics, Protestants, who had all sort of gathered in Prague. And Rabbi Judah ben Lo, who again, was a real person, but as far as I know, didn't actually make a golem. But according to the legend, he constructed a golem to defend the Jewish community, because the golem's a sort of very large, strong, powerful man. He's sometimes called like a Jewish Frankenstein monster almost, but in a similar way to the Frankenstein monster from Mary Shelley's novel, the golem the rabbi loses control of his creation, and it sort of wreaks havoc and has to be sort of deactivated. So that's the golem. The dybbuks are something that I think is a little less widely known outside of the Jewish community, but it basically refers to when somebody is possessed by the soul or the spirit of somebody who has died. So it's possession, but not like demonic possession per se. But possession by somebody who had once been a real person. And that's something that has sort of corollaries in non-Jewish folklore as well, but less so as time goes on over the centuries. It becomes something that's more attributed specifically to Yiddish folklore. And I know that the dybbuk has been explored more recently in some films as well.
And yeah, B, I was just about to direct it to you because I know you mentioned to me recently that you were reading a lot about dybbuks, and I was pronouncing it incorrectly before. It's dybbuk?
I may have been mispronouncing it. I don't know.
This goes to show how much I'm going to be learning from both of you today.
I use the term dybbuk, and I think that it's kind of like Kabbalah and Kabbalah, like just like different ways of pronouncing it. But what I've learned is that a dybbuk is usually described as a malevolent spirit that inhabits the body of a human. And it's a term that first appears in 16th century writings, but was largely ignored by mainstream scholarship until the 1910s when S. Ansky's Yiddish play is written. I think he wrote it in between 1912 and 1916. And it's performed in Yiddish in Warsaw in 1920 and then in Moscow in 1922. So Ansky's play is about a young bride who is possessed by the ghost of the man she desired to marry, and the possession ends up breaking off her current plans for an unwanted marriage that was arranged by her father. So there are feminist readings of dybbuk lore that question if there is a possession at all, or if young women were taking on male characteristics to break out of forced unions, which I think is pretty awesome. But yeah, the story that's told by Marcin Rona is Demon, and it kind of turns that dybbuk story on its head, because the body that's being inhabited is actually already male, and the ghost is a bride.
Yeah, I was fascinated by that. I noticed that gender reversal too, and I think both the Golem from 2018, the Paz Brothers film, and Demon, I think we could probably have a whole other episode where we talk about the sort of feminist interpretations of both, or the feminist moments in both. So let's backtrack, and actually I kind of want to start with the Golem now that we sort of have this foundation of what the Golem story traditionally is and what the origins of the kind of dybbuk folklore is. So, and I'll kind of kick this over to Ed to start, but then I would love to have your ideas on this too. But the 2018 film, The Golem, it really kind of does a lot of interesting things with the Golem story that Ed, that you described. So how, I'm curious what you think about how this film fits into or represents that story. How does it change it, and to what effect? And then I think a second sort of angle we could take here is, how does the Golem fit into non-Jewish horror genre traditions? Because I think we could have a whole, again, possibly separate conversation about the kind of creepy kid trope and movies like The Exorcist. And I know, Ed, that you've written on some of that. So I'll start with you, Ed. Let's dive into the Golem from 2018.
Sure. I mean, I think that one of the things with that movie is it was faithful to the legend in that it grounded it as an obviously Jewish story, right? That the origins of the Golem as a kind of folkloric trope come out of the Eastern European Jewish tradition, and it was faithful to that in terms of setting, in terms of characters, in terms of themes and language and so on. So, and that's important to note, because sometimes the Golem is divorced from his kind of cultural origins in a way, and kind of becomes a sort of free floating signifier for created man, as separate from kind of Jewish lore. So I think that the Paz brothers, and obviously so, but they sort of approached that subject with a degree of respect by placing it in this sort of 17th century shtetl, and it sort of presumed a degree of knowledge, I think, about Judaism on behalf of its audience, which was a refreshing thing to see. It wasn't sort of making it necessarily mainstream or separating the Golem from where he comes from originally, right? I think one of the other interesting things, and it's what I talk about a bit in my tablet article that I wrote about the subject a couple years ago, is that it strikes me as characteristically Jewish in a sort of theological sense, in the ways in which I think in how the Paz brothers parse the significance of the Golem, it reflects a certain Jewish theological understanding in the same way, perhaps, that The Exorcist reflects a Christian or a Catholic theological understanding. And I think that those differences are important and interesting. And I can talk about those later on as well. But
yeah, I mean, something that makes me think of, and I think this will sort of come up organically again when we do segue into a larger discussion around Demon, is I'm curious what we all think about whether there's a difference between sort of Jewish horror where the story is maybe culturally Jewish or something that's singular to Jewish identity or Jewish history, versus sort of Judaic or sort of horror that comes from Judaism, like religiously. So yeah, I think that's something that we're going to probably want to go further into when we do talk about Demon. I mean, B, do you have any thoughts on that question? And it's kind of one of the larger questions, I think, through our
definitely. I think that I mean, in the same way that being Jewish isn't a monolith, I don't think Jewish films can be a monolith. So when we're comparing something like The Golem and Demon, we're comparing a film that's like very much rooted in Judaism, and then a film that's rooted in the Yiddish language and the Yiddish memory of Poland. So I think that there is a spectrum there that can be attended to in like so many different ways, that the sort of well of Jewish stories that can be told in a horror lens is definitely not dry in any sort of way.
I think one of the things that I've argued too is in terms of the sort of specifically religious ways in which we can talk about Jewish horror is separate from the kind of cultural particularism, of where the story is set or who the characters are or whatever, is a particular kind of philosophical orientation towards what the ultimate origin of horror is. And this is something that I, identified in Golem, but then in sort of wider, in the film Golem, but then in wider directions as well, is that I think that Jewish horror orients itself towards a strict monotheism in a way that we don't always see in other kind of supernaturally inflected horror literature. And I think that the ultimate origin of terror, horror, evil in like a Jewish film and literature context has to be the kind of one indivisible God, and that there's certain disturbing implications of that, but implications that have to necessarily flow from any kind of strict monotheism. So it's one of the things in Golem that I noted is there's a sense in which all of the bad stuff that happens, at least as I interpreted it, and people I think can disagree with me on this, have their ultimate origin in this kind of singular God. And that's not to say that bad stuff is like secretly good stuff. I don't think it has a solution to theodicy that's quite that simplistic. But I do think it says, in a way that reflects things like the prophetic writings of Isaiah and so on, I do think there's a sense in which God is capable of both good and evil things. And I find that is, at least as I define it, one of the kind of major themes of the theological sense of Jewish horror, at least.
I think what's interesting with that film JeruZalem is one of the lines in it is, if anyone's primitive here, it's us, when he's talking to one of the Arab cast members. I think that there is like a fear that God might not be all benevolent and all good, but there's also this fear that like we are close to God, and the fear that we have is also within ourselves.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think, if we contrast kind of the themes of Jewish horror to something like The Exorcist, obviously the theological context of The Exorcist is monotheistic as well. But I think the way in which the film and William Peter Blatty's novel thinks about evil is it can't help but, even if it's subconsciously, kind of make that evil as something separate from God. So it has a kind of Manichaean basis to it, right? Where you have ultimate good and ultimate evil, and they're sort of in a war with one another. And we all know that, like, theologically speaking, the evil is supposed to be subsumed within the good, that the evil's only allowed to do what it does because of God's omnipotence and omniscience. But it's still, as the narrative progresses, you have that sense that these are two opposing forces that are separate from one another. Whereas I think in Jewish horror, you can't help but remember that evil always has its origin from, as B said, a God who's capable of good and capable of evil. And then I sort of note that I think that sense of horror animates a lot of Jewish literature that we don't think of as necessarily horror in a sort of genre sense. So, in I.B. Singer, I think you see that, or in Franz Kafka is like the great example of that, is this kind of very, if you think through the implications of it, very kind of disturbing, but yet totally conventional religious worldview.
Yeah, this is the B. I'm so glad that you brought up JeruZalem, because what this conversation is making me realize, in the same way that B, you said, Jewish horror and Jewish cinema in general, like Jewishness, is not a monolith. I love that we're each kind of bringing to the table these different ideas of what horror even is, because for me, I always look at a film like JeruZalem in more of this allegorical sense and sort of setting it in the present and what maybe social anxieties or preoccupations are being vented or manifest in a film like that. And so I just wanted to put that out there, that I think we're coming to a lot of really interesting different perspectives on this question of what is Jewish horror. And kind of, so segueing a little bit into Demon, because I think we do want to consider that question a little bit deeper on how a horror film and horror genre conventions, and specifically some of these Jewish horror conventions that we've been talking about, what are they being used for as far as what is being kind of explored through those tropes. So obviously something we didn't touch on with the Golem is that even though it's set in the past, I think it's very interesting in how it's representing kind of anti-Semitism. You have these peasants coming in and blaming the Jewish shtetl for bringing upon them this outbreak of the plague. And it's set in that historical time period, which we talked about. But Demon is kind of responding to history set in the present. So B, I want to kick this over to you. What do you think is the relationship or interplay between, again, this uniquely Jewish horror trope of the dybbuk and the Holocaust?
Underlying in all of these films, whether it's overt or covert, is this question of whether we belong, right? So the link between this film and the Holocaust is unique to a dybbuk story, but it is still using traditional characteristics of dybbuk lore as the means to the same kind of end. Piotr is possessed by a Jewish female spirit, and once her characteristics sort of seep out of Piotr's body, so by the end of the film, the Yiddish language is coming out of Piotr, who never spoke Yiddish beforehand. His body is finally rendered Jewish in this environment and therefore does not belong there. And the marriage between him and a Polish woman of quote unquote pure lineage cannot be sustained because the family will not allow it. So I think that's how Marcin Rona, the late director, is presenting a Holocaust story without beating us over the head with images of genocide, which I found to be more creative and in many ways a more ethical way of telling the story of the Shoah.
I think that word ethical is particularly interesting there too, because it's sort of thinking about the efficacy of horror, which sometimes is denigrated as a genre, in the wider critical culture. I mean, increasingly less so, obviously, but not in a stereotypical sense. And I think that you're absolutely right, is that you have the ability to kind of depict unknowable or ineffable things through this kind of language of horror.
No doubt films like The Pianist and Schindler's List are so important. They're important contributions to the canon, not just in Jewish cinema, but in global cinema. But do I think we need to retell the story of the Holocaust by building more hyper-realistic sets? Absolutely not. I believe actors and extras filling these roles, there's something extremely disturbing about having to be a Jewish prisoner and having to experience acting out torture. And I think viewing these things can be re-traumatic. So there's something that the horror lens, the dybbuk story, lends to us when telling these stories that I think is more ethical.
Yeah, and I think I agree with that. I think that's really interesting. Something that I was struck by is this idea that, especially in Demon, it's not it's not gory. It's sort of recreating this trauma through kind of what it's not showing, and that reminded me a lot of like Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, like how you're left with what the aftermath is and the erasure and the grappling with the memory or trying to bury this memory of a kind of cultural historical trauma. That's what I took away from Demon for sure. And something else that I wanted to ask is, we've been obviously talking a lot about the ways in which these films and things like the Golem and the dybbuk are rooted in Jewishness, but something that I thought was really interesting about demon is that until you hear that word, it almost comes across as this ghost possession story for those who are perhaps watching and not really aware that it has that Jewish lens. So I don't know, B, what are your thoughts on all of that? The idea that it's showing without really showing, and that, you know, maybe someone without a sort of Jewish perspective might be bringing something different to the film watching experience, and what might they take away? Because again, I'm kind of learning about all of the Jewish aspects of this, but as a horror fan, I was just thinking about all of the genre aspects of a film like Demon.
It's interesting because if you're not Jewish, I watched this in very specific circumstances. I went to the Jewish Film Festival. I saw this film when it debuted. I sat next to an Israeli woman who told me that the main character was Israeli. But if you're going into this and you don't know who the main character is, you don't know his lineage, you don't know his heritage, if you go into this, there is no subtitles for the Yiddish portions of this film. If you don't know what Yiddish sounds like, if you don't have like a family member that speaks that language, and I'm sure in the future someone's going to watch this and they'll have never heard that language before. It might be dead by the time my kids watch it, right? So if you're not Jewish, you kind of come to this and you might be lost. You might need a Jewish friend to sit next to you and sort of guide you through this film to tell you exactly what it's about. But if you are Jewish, it's something that you pick up on very quickly. You see the word Hana, you carved into the walls. You see him break glass accidentally in the beginning with his foot instead of throwing it behind his shoulder in like the Polish tradition. So yeah, I think that this is a really interesting film in that, right? That you kind of need Jewish guidance in order to interpret it for what it is.
Right. Otherwise, it doesn't really land as a response to the Holocaust at all, to a viewer who maybe isn't even getting that context until late into the film, right?
There is that one Jewish character who kind of gets treated in a very particular way. He's sort of ignored. You can tell that he doesn't belong amongst all of these Polish people, and he's able to tell the story towards the end of the film. But I really believe that I would have been very lost if I didn't have a Jewish upbringing.
So I kind of want to go in a slightly different direction and just ask, it's kind of an open question. Ed, we'll start with you, and then B, I want your thoughts as well on this. Why do we think there are not as many Jewish horror movies as there could be? Obviously, there are a ton that we won't get to talk about today, coming out of Israel and so on. But what other possibilities exist within Judaism or Jewishness, whether that's theological or spiritual or, again, cultural, historical, for horror storytelling that lends them, what things can lend themselves really well to horror storytelling, and why do we not have those films yet? I want them. I don't know. I think we all do.
I think that, there's a certain irony to it because some of the great horror directors, so many of them are Jewish, right? So William Friedkin, who directed The Exorcist, Stanley Kubrick, who directed The Shining, and so on. So, and there's more than that, back to the golden age of Hollywood as well. But the engagement with like explicitly Jewish themes, you're absolutely right, is pretty rare. I think that part of that, I would imagine, and this is just a hypothesis, has to do with the way in which mainstream cinema in the United States has traditionally avoided anything that I think seems too ethnically particular. And that's, I think, a conscious decision to kind of try and appeal to the broadest possible number of people in an audience as they can. Of course, in the contemporary era, where we have so many more options for viewing different types of films and streaming platforms, and really a sort of proliferation of voices that weren't really heard before, I think there's a lot more possibility of engaging things in the horror genre that might be more specifically Jewish, whether, as you say, culturally or theologically or whatnot. I do think that, and I'm speaking of this as a non-specialist, but I do think that there's a preponderance of interesting ideas and themes and types of characters and monsters, for that matter, right? And different things that exist in Jewish folklore that could be really prime kind of subject matter for horror. So currently I'm working on a book called Pandemonium, An Illustrated History of Demonology. So this is what I'm spending my October doing right now. And I begin in antiquity. And so a lot of what I've been looking at are sort of the complex and really multifaceted, interesting demonologies that exist in both Judaism and Christianity. And because of movies like The Exorcist, people are sort of aware of like demon lore in Christianity. But Judaism has every bit as much of a rich kind of tradition of talking about these sort of supernatural elements as does Christianity. So, for example, a character like Lilith, who's a succubi that's drawn from Assyrian mythology, but then becomes a really important kind of demonic creature in Jewish apocrypha and Jewish legend and folklore. I could see a fantastic horror movie about Lilith, right? There's nothing like that right now, or any number of other kind of figures or creatures that exist across myth and legends. So I think that there's a real possibility to kind of see what is provocative and interesting in Jewish legends, and to maybe depict these things that have not been depicted before, instead of kind of retelling the exact same horror stories over and over.
Speaking of Syria, when I first started my graduate program, I befriended a woman who I'm still friends with today, who left Syria as a child. And I was set on studying horror, and I expressed that to her in hopes of having a friend to watch horror films with me. And she refused and quite simply said that there was enough horror in the Middle East, that she doesn't need to watch horror because life was already terrifying enough. And although Semitic experiences are also not a monolith, I think that this particular anecdote can be a foundation for my answer to this question, which is Jews are taught that we are different. We have been racialized. We have been tortured. We have been murdered. There have been pogroms, and there was slavery, and there was genocide. So there's part of me that thinks that Jewish people aren't going to run to the box office to watch themselves in these situations and in horrific situations, because it's kind of what our upbringing is about, is learning the history of being othered, of never really belonging. All of our holidays kind of seem to be, they tried to kill us, we didn't die, let's eat. So I don't necessarily think that there's a huge popular need for this. I don't know if there's an audience that is really there to fill a theater to watch these films if they are made.
I think that's, I'll be honest, I never thought of it that way. I think, as I've mentioned before, I grew up kind of thinking about horror as a genre that is so uniquely positioned to kind of vent those things. And so that's my perspective on it, but I can also totally see that side of it. What I think is interesting, what I'll just add to this, is that, again, the Golem, it's a period piece. It feels so specifically Jewish in so many ways. I mean, even down to the way it's using horror tropes beyond the Golem folklore. I mean, there's a really violent scene involving a shofar, and then you have something like Demon, where we've talked about this too now, that we've kind of come to the realization that maybe a viewer that doesn't have this perspective, it's going to not have the same impact or messaging for that viewer. And so I'm, hearing both of your different takes on this, I'm really torn. I mean, I'd love I know that there was just a podcast episode that got put out by Eli Roth where he interviews Ari Aster, and he says, how are these two nice Jewish boys making such violent, horrific movies? And so on one hand, I do want to see what sensibilities they would bring to a film that dabbles in Jewishness a little bit more, but I also completely agree that there are certain topics that maybe are even too sensitive to be adequately handled in a genre like horror. So I kind of land in the middle. I don't, I think there is, as we've already discussed as well, there is this difference between having horror movies that are maybe rooted in the theology or the spirituality versus the culture and the history.
Yeah, and I think that's a totally fair point. That one of the risks with horror as a genre is if it veers in towards the exploitative, right, or the kind of shocking for the purposes of just being shocking. So, I think like if I had heard that like Eli Roth was doing a specifically Jewish horror movie, I think I'd be a little bit worried, right, about what directions that's gonna necessarily go in. So I agree with you. I think it's a interesting kind of question about being ambivalent about the possibility and the ethics of kind of what we present and what we consume.
So I think this brings us to what might be our final question, and we've been edging toward it this whole time. And I think it could open up, again, kind of a longer discussion. Anything that you both are thinking of that maybe we haven't touched on. I mean, we certainly didn't talk that much about JeruZalem and the fact that while there is so much in that film rooted in both religion and I think, again, society, the creatures themselves in that film, though, I am always fascinated by the fact that they're sort of these winged demon zombies, and the fact that that's kind of a unique creation, whereas the dybbuk and the golem are not. So that film's doing some really interesting things that we could talk about further. But all in all, I kind of want to close us out with what you both think the definition is of Jewish horror cinema. What attributes do you think these films that we've been talking about, what do they have in common? Is there a through line, a sensibility, or again, kind of edging away from the idea that this could ever be a monolith? What, let's try to wrap up what the nuances are of all of these films, and whether we want more horror films told through a Jewish lens or not. What do you think the impact is of telling these stories through Jewish lenses with Jewish monsters and myths? I will start with you, Ed, and then B. I know that it's an open-ended question, but I just feel like there's so much here that, that we could still talk about and kind of edging toward some kind of answer as to what is Jewish horror cinema.
Sure. I think that, and one of the things I explore in the tablet piece is thinking about what kind of defines Jewish horror as a genre, and then beyond even film and into literature as well, and beyond to the kind of like, if it's set in 17th century Poland or something, is that kind of ethical imperative that I talked about earlier, where I think it's this awareness. Jewish horror is written from a perspective that it is aware that good and evil can both have their origins in this kind of singular deity, right? And that there are, in one hand, kind of disturbing implications of that, but on the other hand, there's, I think, a whole different kind of moral and ethical understanding that flows from that. And the contrast that I draw that to, the comparison I make, is I say it's very different, for example, from something like H.P. Lovecraft's horror. So the kind of Lovecraftian mythos where you have this sort of realm of like amoral, nihilistic, super powerful, not quite gods, but basically gods, because this is a universe in which God doesn't exist, right? And I think that seems very conventionally disturbing to people, and there's reasons for that, obviously. But I think that the sort of Jewish conception of horror, coming out of that kind of I create the light and I create the darkness line from the book of Isaiah, is one in which you kind of give due deference and honor to the sovereignty and power of God, but that is but you're also aware that malevolence or darkness or evil stems from that singular God as well as good at the same time. And so I think that what you see in the kind of best of Jewish horror, and in that article, I identify Kafka as who I think of as the greatest Jewish horror novelist of all time. And I think it's this very kind of, on the surface, it seems very disturbing and absurd and dark, but there is kind of a hopefulness that runs through it as well in an interesting way and in a profound ethical sensibility. So I think that the benefit that Jewish horror has is an ethical awareness in a really kind of profound metaphysical way that might not always be implicit in other types of horror. And I think that perspective is a powerful one, whether or not it's set in a conventionally Jewish cultural context or not. So I think that kind of worldview is a fascinating one. And I don't know exactly what sort of form that always has to take, but I do think it's something that has a lot of power and significance to it.
So first I want to correct myself. I read my notes wrong. I had a quote in there that says, if anyone's primitive here, it's us. And that's actually from Big Bad Wolves, which is that Israeli torture film, which I confused with JeruZalem. But JeruZalem has a similar theme of Arab-Jewish relations where as soon as, and this is a spoiler, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to do that, but in JeruZalem, one of the Arab cast members gets killed by a Jewish American, and all of a sudden they have no idea where they are in the caves going back to Israel. And I think that there's an underlying fear that, one, we don't belong, and who has occupied these spaces before us, and when will we belong? And then you have the same sort of anxieties in Demon, where the belonging is again a geographical concern, where things feel familiar, but at the same time there is an uncanniness about them. And I think that's what Jewishness can bring to a film, is this sort of disorientation of where exactly we stand and where we belong. And that can be a bodily sensation with a dybbuk, or it can be a quite literal feeling of being lost in a cave.
I think that is a perfect place to end things, because again, I think what each of you have made me realize is that Jewish horror cinema has all this potential and all of these different layers, and that it can be rooted in so many different sources, whether that's a kind of experience or a religious sensibility. This world is so much richer than I even thought. So I just want to thank you both again so much for being with me today. Why don't we just let the listeners know if either of you have anything to plug, or where they can find you online, or what you're all up to. And Ed, I'll start with you.
Sure. I guess please check out my website. It's www.edsimon.org. So I'm an organization, apparently. And I keep that updated with all of my new writings. I can also be followed on Twitter with Ed Simon. So WITHEDSIMON. And my most recent book is called Printed in Utopia: The Renaissance's Radicalism, and that's available wherever books are sold, as they say.
I am most active on Instagram, so you can find me at Brookenreich, BROOKENREICH. And I frequently publish in Oz Magazine, which is an Atlanta-based business-to-business film and television magazine. So check that out at ozmagazine.com.
Awesome. Thank you both again so much. This was really enlightening for me, and I think perfect for Halloween time. So thank you again, really. As always, I'm Sara Glassberg. Producing and editing the show is our technical director, Chris Holland. My co-host is Brad Pilcher. Thank you again so much to our guests, B. Sonenreich and Ed Simon. The music you've been hearing throughout this episode is by the incredibly talented Joe Alterman. Please look him up wherever you get your music. You can find more from us as well as show notes at ajff.org/inconversation. Our email address is inconversation@ajff.org. Drop us a question or comment, and we might just include you on a future episode. Don't forget to subscribe in your podcast app of choice, or check out our YouTube channel for new episodes. Give us a rating or a review. It all helps. But what helps perhaps more than anything is your financial support. We cannot continue to do this podcast or any of our other digital programs without the ongoing support of listeners like you. If you are willing and able, please consider making a donation at ajff.org/inconversation. And don't forget to tell your friends about the show. Until next time, goodbye.